Why was everyone looking past her, as if she wasn't even there? Sarah Martinez stacked another box of ammunition behind the counter, the cardboard rough against her palms, sweat sticking to her forehead. She had been at Morrison's gun shop in downtown Phoenix for 3 months, and still, the smell of gun oil clung to her hair long after she left. Most days it didn't bother her, but the stares, those quiet, doubting stares, were harder to wash off. At 24, Sarah didn't look like what people expected behind a wall of rifles and shotguns. She was petite, her voice soft, her movements careful and deliberate. Customers saw her and assumed she was a clerk, someone there to run the register, maybe sweep the floors. Never the one who actually knew the tools they came to buy. The bell above the door chimed, and 3 men in brand-new hunting gear swaggered inside. Sarah recognized them immediately. The type with money to burn and egos even heavier than the rifles they carried on weekends. The tallest wore a camouflage jacket with the price tag still dangling from the zipper. His boots were polished, his grin sharp. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, swagger dripping from every syllable. "Is there a man working today, someone who can help us with the real guns?" He smirked at his friends. "We're not looking for any pink pistols." The laughter stung, though Sarah kept her expression calm. She had been through this before dozens of times. The same lazy dismissal, the same assumption that her presence here was a mistake, that she didn't belong. Still, the sting reached her neck, that heat of embarrassment she couldn't always fight down. "I can help you with whatever you need," she said quietly, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their slight tremor. "What kind of firearms are you looking for?" The man leaned across the counter, his grin widening. "We're talking long range, little lady. Elk season. 400 yards, maybe more. You probably don't even know what that means." Sarah's jaw tightened. 400 yards. She knew exactly what it meant. Not just the number, but the way the bullet would drop, the wind's invisible push across open desert, the pause between heartbeats where the rifle became an extension of the body. She knew it all better than he ever would, but her voice stayed even. 400 yards is a challenge," she said. "Are you considering bolt action or semi-auto, and what's your experience level?" The man's smugness faltered, replaced with indignation. "Experience? I've been hunting since before you were born, princess. I just need someone who knows what they're doing to show me the good stuff. Where's your boss?" Behind them, Frank Morrison, the elderly regular, shook his head. He had been coming here for years, and he knew the truth. Knew that Sarah Martinez had more knowledge in one hand than these men carried between them. But he stayed quiet, just watching. The man tapped the counter. "Go get him, sweetheart. We're serious customers. Don't waste our time." Something in Sarah's chest shifted. The trembling faded. The hurt hardened into something steadier. Her eyes, soft a moment ago, sharpened with a quiet edge. "I am serious," she said, her voice calm, controlled. "I do know what I'm talking about, but if you'd prefer to wait, my colleague Jim will be back from lunch in 20 minutes. The man smirked again, satisfied. "Yeah, that's probably for the best. No offense, honey, just this isn't really a job for someone like you." Their laughter followed them through the aisles as if she couldn't hear, as if she were invisible. Sarah walked to the back room, her chest heavy. She had learned to live with this weight, but it didn't get easier. Being dismissed before she even spoke. Being underestimated before she had a chance to show anything. She sat on a stool, pulling out her phone. On the screen was a faded photograph. Her younger self, 12 years old, smiling beside an elderly man with weathered hands. His eyes, kind but sharp, had seen war. He held a rifle across his lap, and even in the old photo his posture told a story. Decades of mastery. "I wish you were here, Grandpa," she whispered. "You always said I was ready. Maybe it's time to prove it." The bell chimed again in the front, new customers walking in, the weight of another day waiting. Sarah wiped her eyes, tucked the phone away, and stepped out, her face composed. None of them knew her secret. None of them knew the bloodline she carried. The legendary marksman who had raised her. the man who had once told her, "The most important shot isn't the first one. It's the one that matters most." Sarah was about to find out how true that was. That evening the shop emptied. Jim locked up and waved goodbye, leaving Sarah in the quiet glow of flickering fluorescent lights. Most nights she would have gone home, collapsed onto her couch, let the fatigue of proving herself wash over her. But not tonight. Tonight she stayed. The range behind the shop was worn down, its walls stained with decades of bullets, the concrete floor chipped. But to Sarah, it was sacred ground. This was where she practiced after hours, keeping alive the connection to the man who had taught her everything. She pulled out her grandfather's Winchester Model 70, old, heavy, well-worn, but perfect. The same rifle he had used during sniper training in Vietnam. She ran her fingers along the wood, the smell of oil and dust rising. Every mark on the stock carried memory. Her grandfather, Master Sergeant Robert Eagley Martinez, had never boasted about his military record, but history had whispered his name. One of the finest marksmen of his generation. Vietnam, special operations, training future snipers at Fort Bragg. His students had carried his lessons into battlefields around the world. For Sarah, he had been more than a soldier. He had been a teacher, patient, relentless, and deeply proud of her. From the time she was 12, he had drilled her in lessons most shooters would never touch, reading wind by the ripple of grass, timing breaths until the heartbeat itself was a metronome, shooting not just with skill, but with patience, with respect, with humility. She set her target at 50 yards, loaded the rifle, settled into the position that felt like coming home. Breath in, breath out, a heartbeat. The trigger broke cleanly and the bullet punched into the 10 ring. One after another, 5 shots, smooth, steady, unbroken. Jim poked his head in, his voice carrying the kind of respect few had shown her. "Still here, Sarah, almost 9 o'clock." She smiled faintly, ejecting the spent cartridge. "Just finishing." He walked over, eyes widening at the target. The shots were so tight they could have been made by one bullet. That's not just good, that's professional. Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah hesitated. "My grandfather taught me." Jim whistled low. "Honey, that's more than teaching, that's mastery. You ever think about competing?" Her pulse quickened. She had thought about it. She had dreamed about it. But dreams were dangerous when you worked behind a counter being laughed at by men in camo jackets. Jim leaned in, lowering his voice. "Phoenix PD got their marksmanship competition next month. Civilians can enter. Big deal around here. Long-range category's the toughest. 600 yards, wind, time limits. Most folks don't even finish. But you," he nodded at the target, "you'd turn heads." Sarah laughed nervously. "It's expensive." "I'll cover your fee," Jim said. "Call it an investment. I've got a feeling about you, Sarah Martinez. More to you than meets the eye." That night in her small apartment, Sarah stared at the entry form. On her wall, photos of Montana summers lined the plaster. Her and her grandfather on the ranch, dusty competitions, trophies she had won as a teenager. One picture caught her, the day she was 16, holding a small gold trophy. Her grandfather's eyes had been wet with pride. "Sarah," he had told her, "you have a gift most people only dream of. But remember, it's not about proving yourself to others. It's about honoring the tradition. One day you'll show the world what you can do, but do it for the right reasons." She held the pen, signed her name, and for the first time in years she felt his hand on her shoulder, invisible, steady. 3 weeks. That was all the time she had. 3 weeks until she stepped onto a line with men who would laugh at her again. 3 weeks until she showed them why her grandfather had believed she was ready. But as she sealed the envelope, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That one bullet, one shot would prove everything. Why did they always laugh first, before she even had a chance to prove herself? Word about the upcoming Phoenix Police Department marksmanship competition spread quickly through the small shooting community. Morrison's gun shop turned into a buzzing hive of opinions. Customers leaned against glass counters, boasting about gear, debating calibers, and speculating who might win. Sarah stood quietly behind the register, listening, her hand steady on the cash drawer even as her pulse quickened. She had mailed the entry form. There was no turning back now. Derek Hoffman and his friends swaggered in more often these days, their voices carrying across the shop like they owned the place. He was the type who filled silence with his own bravado, talking loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm bringing my custom Remington 700, Derek said one afternoon, grinning as he leaned against the counter. $8 grand, built by a gunsmith in Colorado. That rifle shoots tighter than most people can even dream of. 600 yards, please. I'll clean house." His buddy chuckled. "Tell her about the state championship, Derek." Derek smirked, eyes flicking toward Sarah. "Placed third 2 years ago. Competition shooters from all over Arizona. Real shooters, not hobbyists." Sarah's face didn't change. Her voice was polite, steady. "Congratulations, third place is impressive." Inside, she measured his words. Third place. Respectable. But trophies didn't tell the whole story. She had learned that from her grandfather. The real test wasn't what you won when conditions were perfect. It was what you could still do when everything was against you. Derek tilted his head. "What about you, sweetheart? You entering, maybe the pistol event, they've got a ladies' division." His friends laughed. Sarah's eyes didn't waver. "Actually, I'm entered in the precision rifle category." The laughter stopped. For a second the whole shop seemed to pause. Derek blinked, then burst out laughing again, louder this time. "The precision rifle, that's the most difficult event there is. You sure you don't want to start with something a little more appropriate?" In the corner, Frank Morrison cleared his throat. "Careful, Derek. Sometimes the quiet ones surprise you." Derek waved him off. "No offense, Frank, but this isn't about surprises. This is serious competition. Former military, police, snipers, professionals. It's not a place for beginners." Sarah's cheeks warmed. Embarrassment, anger, a storm she had lived with for years. She wanted to tell him the truth, that her grandfather had trained some of the very men Derek idolized, that her life had been built around marksmanship since she was 12. But her grandfather's voice returned to her, steady and calm. "Never reveal your hand until it matters. Let your shooting do the talking." That night Sarah drove out to the desert range 40 minutes from Phoenix. The city lights faded behind her, replaced by a sky littered with stars. Out here the silence was vast, the air crisp. No smug voices, no laughter, only her and the rifle. The private range stretched out with targets at distances most people never touched. 300 yards, 400, 600, 1,000. Her membership here had drained what little savings she had, but it was the only place she could practice the way her grandfather taught her. She carried the Winchester Model 70 to the bench, its weight familiar, its balance perfect. She set up at the 600-yard line, the distance that would decide everything at the competition. The desert wind whispered across her cheek, shifting, steady then gusting. Her grandfather's lessons came back like a song she had never forgotten. Wind isn't random, it has rhythm, it has patterns. Wait, watch, then trust yourself. She closed her eyes, breathed in, breathed out, waited for the pause between heartbeats. The shot cracked across the desert, echoing off distant rock. Through the scope she saw the bullet tear through the 10 ring. She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate, she just worked the bolt, fired again and again. When she walked downrange, the 5 holes were grouped so tightly they could have been covered by a coffee cup. Perfect by most standards. But she heard his voice again. "Good enough isn't good enough. One day, Sarah, the shot that matters most will come when you least expect it. Can you make it then?" She packed up in silence, the stars glittering above. The competition was 2 weeks away. 2 weeks to prove that her silence had never been weakness. Back at the shop, the whispers grew. Some customers scoffed, others were curious. Frank Morrison, leaning on the counter one morning, gave her a nod. "Don't listen to the noise, they don't know what you carry." But the pressure was there, heavy on her chest. Each night when she practiced, she thought about her grandfather, about the last words he ever told her before cancer took him. "You don't need the world to believe in you, Sarah. You just need to believe in yourself when the moment comes." The morning of the competition arrived hot and clear, the Arizona sun already burning when Sarah pulled into the parking lot of the Ben Avery shooting facility. Her grandfather's rifle lay in its case beside her, worn but cared for. She carried it in one hand, a small cooler in the other. Around her, the lot buzzed with activity. More than 60 competitors, most with custom rifles, advanced optics, range-finding binoculars, ballistic computers. Sarah's Winchester looked like a relic among them, but she carried it with quiet reverence. "First time competing?" a voice asked. She turned to see a man in his 50s, posture straight, eyes sharp. His badge read, "LT, Call James Harrison, U.S. Army, retired." "Yes, sir," Sarah said. He studied her rifle, nodding. "Model 70, 1970s. Someone took good care of that. Beautiful weapon, family piece." Sarah's throat tightened. "My grandfather." Harrison's eyes softened. "A family tradition, rifles like that, they don't just shoot, they teach. Don't let the fancy gear intimidate you. At the end of the day, it's not the rifle, it's the shooter." She felt a flicker of calm. His words echoed her grandfather's own. But then she heard Derek's voice, loud as ever. "See that girl with the antique rifle? She thinks she's going to play with the big boys. I almost feel sorry for her." Harrison's jaw tightened. He raised his voice. "That little girl is holding a rifle that's probably forgotten more about accuracy than your custom gun will ever know." The crowd murmured. Derek flushed but covered it with bravado. "We'll see." Sarah lowered her eyes, hiding the small, quiet smile that touched her lips. The range officer called the first relay to the line. Sarah wasn't up yet. She stood back, watching, her heart pounding. Competitors lay prone, rifles steady, scopes trained on 300-yard targets. She watched Derek shoot first. His form was textbook, his first 2 shots crisp in the 10 ring, but Sarah noticed the flaw others missed. He was rushing. By his 3rd shot, frustration crept in. The group widened. Respectable, yes, but not flawless. Then Harrison took his place. Calm, measured, each shot deliberate, each one cutting into the target as though the distance didn't exist. Military precision. His grouping was so tight it could have been covered by a playing card. "That's how it's done," Derek muttered to his friends, pretending not to notice Sarah watching. Finally, Sarah's name was called. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She walked to her station, Winchester in hand. 60 competitors, a crowd of onlookers, skeptical eyes. One of only 3 women, the youngest by far. She spread her mat, laid down, and set her rifle in place. Her grandfather's voice whispered in her memory. "When it's your turn, Sarah, everyone else disappears. It's just you, the rifle, and the target." The range officer's voice carried. "Relay 3, you have 15 minutes, 5 shots at 300 yards. Shooters may commence firing when ready." Sarah breathed, in, out, settled her cheek against the worn stock. Through her scope, the black circle of the bulls awaited, crisp and clear. She adjusted for the steady 10-mile wind. The trigger broke. The recoil lifted against her shoulder. Through her scope, the first bullet tore into the 10 ring. 1 shot down, 4 to go, and the weight of silence pressing against her like the whole world was holding its breath. How steady could her hands stay when the world's eyes were on her? Sarah's cheek pressed against the stock of the Winchester, the smell of worn walnut and oiled steel grounding her in the present. The desert air was dry, heat shimmering above the sand berms, the faint whistle of wind tugging at the flags that lined the range. She ignored the whispers behind her. The muttering, the laughter, all of it was background noise now. She had been here before, not on this firing line, not with a crowd, but in the fields of Montana, her grandfather at her side, his voice calm and steady. Everything disappears, Sarah. It's just you, the rifle, and the target. Nothing else exists. Her breathing slowed. In, out. She let her heart settle into rhythm, her finger finding the familiar curve of the trigger. The crosshairs hovered over the center ring, waiting for that perfect stillness between breaths. The Winchester cracked. Recoil pushed into her shoulder, sharp but familiar. Through the scope, she saw the hole bloom in the 10 ring left of center, exactly where she had aimed. Around her, other rifles fired, brass clattering onto mats. Competitors grunted, cursed under their breath, adjusted their optics. But Sarah was still. She let the rhythm take her. Second shot, another pause between heartbeats, another squeeze. The bullet struck high in the 10 ring, nearly touching the first. She didn't smile, didn't let the rush of pride distract her. She chambered the next round, her movements smooth and unhurried. By her fourth shot, she knew by the feel of the trigger breaking, by the recoil and the clear sound of the bullet tearing through paper. All of them were 10s, not guesses, not hopes, certainty. Years of training had built that confidence into her bones. When the ceasefire was called, Sarah lowered her rifle, her breath catching. For a moment, silence pressed heavy against her ears. Then the murmurs began. Perfect string. Tight grouping. Who is she? The range officers walked the line, scoring targets, recording numbers. When they read Sarah's score aloud, shooter 38, 50 points, group size .9 inches, the buzz grew louder. She sat back, her hands trembling now that it was over, not from nerves but from release. Behind her, Derek scoffed, though his voice cracked just slightly. Beginner's luck. Wait until 400 yards. Sarah didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She remembered her grandfather's words. Don't waste yourself on proving them wrong. Prove yourself right. As the next relay set up, Sarah stepped off the line, carrying the Winchester back to her mat. The rifle's weight felt heavier now, not from strain but from expectation. She had entered this competition as a nobody. Now all eyes were turning toward her. During the break, she sat beneath a shade tent, sipping from her water bottle. Across the way, Harrison approached, his expression calm but his eyes bright. That was textbook, he said, nodding at her target still clipped to the scoring board. Patience, control, precision. You shoot like someone who's been trained, not like a hobbyist. Sarah felt the heat rise to her cheeks. My grandfather taught me. Harrison studied her face for a long moment. Then he smiled faintly. He taught you well. I've been competing for 30 years, and I don't see shooting like that very often. His words settled over her like a quiet shield against the laughter she'd endured for so long. But Derek wasn't done. He strutted past, his Remington slung across his shoulder, voice pitched just loud enough for others to hear. 300 yards is nothing. Wait until 6. That's when the real shooters separate from the kids. Sarah glanced at him once, meeting his eyes. Not with anger, not with challenge, just silence. And in that silence, Derek shifted, his grin faltering for the first time. That night back in her apartment, Sarah laid the Winchester across her lap, her hands tracing its grooves as if they were lines on a map. Her walls were still covered with the photos of her and her grandfather. Each one now felt like a weight pressing on her chest, reminding her of the promise she carried. She remembered a lesson from years ago. She had been 14, prone in the grass on the Montana ranch, her rifle sighted on a tin can balanced on a post 300 yards away. She had missed twice, tears stinging her eyes, her grandfather watching silently beside her. I can't do it, she had whispered. He had leaned close, his voice firm but kind. Sarah, missing is part of learning. The bullet doesn't define you. The patience does. The discipline, can you breathe again? Can you find calm again? That's what separates a marksman from the rest. That night she had made the shot, and her grandfather had nodded, not with surprise but with certainty. as if he had known all along she would find it in herself. Now sitting in her apartment, Sarah whispered into the silence, "I'll make you proud, Grandpa. I'll make the shot that matters most." The second stage was scheduled for the next day. 400 yards, stronger winds, trickier light, the conditions that could scatter even the best shooters. When she arrived the next morning, the energy was different. Some competitors had already been eliminated, their scores too low to advance. The ones who remained carried themselves with more focus, less chatter. Even Derek's confidence had dulled, though his arrogance flickered stubbornly like a flame that refused to die. 400 yards, 5 shots, 15 minutes, the range officer called. Wind information will not be provided. Shooters must read and adjust accordingly. The line of competitors stretched out again, mats laid, rifles braced. Sarah's position was only a few spots from Derek's. She could hear him muttering to his friends, though his voice sounded tighter than the day before. This is where experience matters. Anyone can shoot 300, 400. That's where we see who belongs. Sarah's hands were steady as she loaded her cartridges. She studied the range. The flags flickered wildly, gusts cutting across the desert floor. Mirage shimmered above the targets, bending the air in waves that made the bullseye dance. Most shooters would rely on the flags alone, but Sarah's grandfather had taught her to see deeper, to watch the way heat rippled, to listen to the way the wind carried through the grass, to feel its rhythm. She closed her eyes just for a moment. The crowd faded. The murmurs fell silent. She was back in Montana, back in the fields, her grandfather beside her, his hand on her shoulder. Wind isn't random. It has a pattern. Find it and it will carry you. The command was given. Competitors began firing almost immediately, anxious to get their shots off before the wind shifted. But Sarah waited, watching, feeling. The lull came, just a breath in the chaos. She fired. The bullet cut through the mirage, struck the bullseye just left of center. Perfect. The second shot followed 20 seconds later, another lull, dead center. Her lips parted in the faintest smile. He would have been proud of that one. Around her the others were struggling. Shots scattering across targets, groups widening with each gust. Derek cursed after his third shot, frustration twisting his face. His expensive rifle was useless against his impatience. Sarah waited again. 3 minutes, 4, patience that felt like steel in her veins. When the lull came, she took her third shot, 10 ring. Her fourth, another lull, dead center again. By the time she prepared for her fifth, the wind was wild, shifting across the range in complex layers. She waited nearly 6 minutes, the clock ticking down, sweat trickling down her temple. She could feel the eyes on her, the weight of expectation pressing harder with every second. Then the pattern came, subtle, a breath of steadiness across the line. She fired. Through her scope she saw it, the bullet tearing into the exact center of the bull's. 5 shots, 5 tens. When the ceasefire was called, Sarah lowered her rifle, her hands trembling, not from fear but from release. The range officer's voice carried. Shooter 38, 50 points. Group size 1.8 inches. The crowd erupted. Sarah exhaled slowly, her eyes closing. Somewhere inside she could almost hear him again. Patience, Sarah, that's the mark of a true marksman. What happens when silence begins to speak louder than words? By the end of the 400-yard stage, Sarah Martinez was no longer invisible. The whispers followed her everywhere now. Whispers of respect, curiosity, even awe. Competitors who had laughed at the sight of her vintage rifle now studied her like they were the ones trying to learn. She hadn't planned for this, didn't want it, not like this. Attention made her uneasy. She preferred the shadows, the quiet places where her skills belonged to her alone, where the only eyes watching had been her grandfather. But once you put a bullet downrange, the truth was there for everyone to see. At the hydration tent, she sat quietly with her canteen, her hands wrapped around it like an anchor. Conversations buzzed around her. Never seen grouping like that at 400. Old Winchester, can you believe it? She's steady, too steady. That doesn't happen by accident. Derek's voice cut through the chatter like broken glass. Luck, that's all it is. Beginner's streak. 600 yards will expose her. That's where the real shooters earn their place. Sarah kept her eyes on the ground. She didn't need to answer. But Frank Morrison, who had come out from the shop just to watch her, turned on Derek with sharpness in his voice. She's outshot you at every stage so far, Derek. Maybe the problem isn't her luck. Maybe it's your pride. Derek flushed, his jaw clenching, but he didn't fire back. He just stalked away, his friends trailing behind. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison approached, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Exceptional work," he said simply. His tone wasn't patronizing, wasn't surprised. It was recognition, one professional to another. "Your grandfather must have been quite the teacher." Sarah hesitated, her throat tightening. "He was." Harrison nodded once, then let her be. The rest of the day passed in a haze. More shooters were eliminated as scores were tallied. Only the top competitors would advance to the final stage. The 600-yard line, the distance that turned good shooters into amateurs, the range where even veterans faltered. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Sarah's name was on the list. She had not just qualified, she had placed second overall, behind only Harrison. When she saw her number posted, her heart kicked hard in her chest. She had expected to compete. She had not expected this. That night back in her apartment, she couldn't sleep. The Winchester rested on the table beside her, the scope gleaming faintly in the light of a single lamp. She ran her fingers along the wood, remembering every summer, every dawn spent beside her grandfather. The memory came back so vividly she could almost smell the Montana grass, hear the wind whispering through the pines. She was 16 again, lying prone on the ridge behind his ranch. The target had been an old steel plate at 600 yards. She remembered her frustration, the way she had cursed the shifting wind, the way the plate seemed to dance and taunt her through the scope. Her grandfather had crouched beside her, patient as ever. "Sarah, stop fighting it. Don't curse the wind. Listen to it. Respect it. It's telling you a story. If you're stubborn, you'll miss. If you're patient, it will carry you." She had listened then, had waited, and the plate had rung clear as a bell, the sound echoing across the valley. Now in her small Phoenix apartment, she whispered into the silence, "I hear you, Grandpa. I'll listen tomorrow." The next morning dawned hotter than before, the desert air alive with heat waves that shimmered across the horizon. Competitors gathered early, nerves tight, voices low. The 600-yard stage was a different beast. Everyone knew it. Sarah walked to her station carrying the Winchester. The rifle felt heavier today, not from the wood or steel, but from the weight of memory, of expectation, of the invisible eyes that seemed to follow her now. Behind the firing line, a crowd had gathered. Word had spread beyond the competitors. Spectators leaned against the fence, some with binoculars, some shading their eyes with their hands. They had heard about the young woman with the antique rifle, about the perfect scores, about the silence that unsettled even the proudest men. Derek was there too, his face pale under the morning sun. His first two stages had left him in the middle of the pack. He wasn't out, but he wasn't leading either. His friends tried to reassure him, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. "She'll crack," he muttered. "Nobody keeps that up at 600. Frank Morrison heard him, leaning on the rail. "She's been cracking your pride since day one. Maybe 600 is where she finishes the job." The range officer's voice carried over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, final stage of the precision rifle competition. 600 yards, 5 shots, 20 minutes. No wind information will be provided. Shooters must adjust and compensate." The line was set. Harrison at one end, calm as a stone. Derek midway, restless, muttering. Sarah near the center, the sun burning hot against the back of her neck. She laid her mat down, stretched out prone, and settled the Winchester against her shoulder. Through the scope, the target looked impossibly small. The bullseye no larger than a marble, wavering in the heat mirage. The wind flags along the range told conflicting stories, fluttering at different angles, different speeds. Her heart raced, her throat was dry, but then she remembered her grandfather's voice, steady, patient. At 600, Sarah, you're not just shooting a bullet, you're conducting a symphony. Wind, heat, humidity, gravity, all of it plays a part. Don't rush the music, wait for the harmony. The command was given. Harrison fired first, his movements calm, his shot finding the 9 ring, steady and solid. Derek rushed his first, and the bullet sailed wide, missing the target entirely. His curse carried across the line, bitter and sharp. Sarah didn't move. She waited, watched, counted the rhythm of the flags, the shifts in the mirage. The pattern emerged, brief windows every 45 seconds when the currents aligned. She exhaled, the crosshairs steadied, her fingers squeezed. The shot broke clean and the bullet tore into the 10 ring just left of center. 1 shot down, 4 to go. The crowd behind her erupted in murmurs. Derek's second shot scattered into the outer rings. Harrison stayed consistent, 9s and 10s, calm but not flawless. Sarah waited again, 2 minutes, 3, then the window. Her second shot cracked, striking the bullseye dead center. She allowed herself the faintest smile. That one's for you, Grandpa. By her third shot, the conditions were worse. Gusts howled, mirage bent the air in waves. She waited nearly 4 minutes, sweat beading on her forehead, the clock ticking down. Then calm. She adjusted, fired. Another 10. Now the whispers were louder. Unbelievable, she's not missing, with that rifle. Sarah stayed inside her silence. Her fourth shot, another perfect 10, grouped so tightly near the second that even the range officer paused, murmuring into his clipboard. By then Harrison had finished, his total strong but not untouchable. Derek had collapsed under pressure, his shots scattered, his voice tight with excuses about crosswinds and gear failure. Sarah had 1 bullet left. The crowd was silent now. The other competitors had finished. Every eye was on her. Even the wind seemed to pause, the desert holding its breath. She watched the flags, waited for the story they were telling. The seconds bled away. 5 minutes left, 4. Sweat trickled down her cheek. And then it came, the alignment she had been waiting for. She breathed in, breathed out, the world fell still, her fingers squeezed. The Winchester cracked. Through the scope, she watched the bullet tear into the exact center of the bulls. 5 shots, 5 10s, a perfect run at 600 yards. The crowd erupted, voices rising, hands clapping, veterans nodding with the rare respect reserved for the exceptional. But Sarah didn't hear them. She stayed prone for a moment longer, her hands trembling, tears stinging her eyes. She wasn't crying for the victory. She was crying because she could almost feel him there, kneeling beside her, hand on her shoulder, whispering, "That's it, Sarah. That's the shot that matters most." What do you say when silence has already spoken for you? The range was still buzzing from the crack of Sarah's last shot. The ceasefire had been called. Competitors were lowering their rifles, brass still smoking on the mats, but no one was really watching anyone else anymore. They were watching her. Sarah Martinez lay still for a moment longer, cheek against the stock, the bullseye in her scope as clear as a star. The world around her blurred into background noise. Only when she finally lifted her head did the noise crash in murmurs, whispers, the shuffling of boots on gravel. She sat up slowly, her breath uneven. The Winchester rested across her lap, its wood warm under the sun, its steel carrying the memory of the man who had held it first. The range officers walked the line with clipboards, measuring group sizes, tallying scores. At Harrison's station, they nodded with respect. At Derek, they shook their heads, jotting notes quietly as he argued under his breath about gusting winds. Then they reached Sarah's target. One officer pressed a caliper against the paper, his brow lifted. He turned to his partner. Dead center, all 5. The other whistled low, then scribbled the measurement down. Sarah heard the words but didn't let herself believe them yet. She stayed sitting, staring down at her hands, her pulse still pounding. Then the announcement came over the PA. Shooter 38, 50 points, group size 1.3 inches, new facility record. The crowd broke. Applause thundered across the range. Even the veterans clapped, heads nodding with rare, genuine admiration. Sarah bowed her head, a tear slipping free, not for herself, for him. This was for you, Grandpa. She stood, gathering her rifle, walking back from the line as people pressed closer, faces eager, voices chasing her. Who is she? Where did she learn? That rifle, it's vintage, isn't it? Derek pushed through the crowd, his arrogance cracked and leaking humility. His friends trailed behind him, silent for once. His voice was tight, forced. Sarah, I owe you an apology. She looked at him, her expression calm. For what? He swallowed hard. For assuming, for everything I said. His shoulders dropped. You shot better than any of us, better than I've seen in years. I was wrong. Sarah didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She just nodded once, her silence sharper than any words could have been. The sun was dipping lower when the competitors gathered at the pavilion for the awards ceremony. The desert sky burned orange and gold, shadows stretching long across the sand. A hush fell as the director stepped onto the stage with a clipboard. This year's precision rifle competition was one of the most competitive in our history, he began. We witnessed extraordinary skill, discipline, and resilience. And today, we saw a performance that will be remembered here for years to come. He read the results. Harrison in second place, his consistency unshaken even by Sarah's brilliance. Derek further down the list, his name met with polite but quiet acknowledgement. And in first place, the director said, his voice lifting, with a perfect score of 150 points and a new record at this facility, Sarah Martinez. The pavilion erupted, applause, cheers, even shouts of respect. Sarah rose, almost in a daze, carrying the Winchester as she walked toward the stage. Each step felt heavier than the last. She had not come here for a trophy. She had come to honor a promise. Yet the weight of the crowd's eyes pressed against her like never before. The trophy was placed in her hands, gleaming in the fading light. She stared at it, the applause still crashing around her heart still tethered to a man who wasn't here to see it. Sarah, the director said, handing her the microphone, would you like to say a few words? Her throat tightened, the crowd blurred in her vision. For a heartbeat she considered refusing, hiding in silence like she always had. But her grandfather's voice returned, steady as ever. One day, Sarah, you'll show the world, but when you do, honor the tradition. She lifted the mic, her voice quiet at first, then growing steadier. First, I want to thank the organizers and the competitors, especially Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. This has been unforgettable. She paused, her eyes dropping to the rifle in her hands. But I can't stand here without telling you the truth. This rifle, it belonged to my grandfather, Master Sergeant Robert Eagley Martinez. A murmur swept the crowd. Heads turned. Veterans in the back stiffened, their expressions changing as if the name carried weight they recognized. He served in Vietnam, Sarah continued, her voice trembling with emotion but strong enough to carry. He was part of an elite sniper unit. After the war, he trained special forces at Fort Bragg. Everything I know I learned from him, not just how to shoot, how to respect the weapon, how to respect the responsibility that comes with it. Her voice cracked, she swallowed. He passed away 2 years ago, but every shot I made today, every decision was because of him. This wasn't just about winning, it was about honoring him. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, sacred. Then Harrison stepped forward from the crowd, his voice firm, carrying across the pavilion. "Robert Martinez," he said, almost in reverence. "Your grandfather was Robert Martinez." Sarah nodded. Harrison's face softened into something rare, respect, almost awe. "Ma'am, your grandfather was a legend. In special operations circles his name is still spoken. His record stood for years. I had the honor of meeting him once. He was one of the finest marksmen this country has ever known." The ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Sarah wasn't just some quiet girl with a lucky streak. She was the granddaughter of a man whose name was carved into history. She lowered the microphone, tears blurring her vision. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a crown. As the ceremony ended, people pressed around her, competitors shaking her hand, reporters asking for interviews, firearms companies already whispering offers. But Sarah stayed quiet, the Winchester clutched against her chest. The noise faded as an older man approached, his steps slow but purposeful. His hands shook as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn photograph. He held it out, his eyes wet with tears. "Miss Martinez," he said softly, "I served with your grandfather in Vietnam. He saved my life twice. I've been waiting 40 years to thank his family. Seeing you here today, honoring him like this, it means everything." Sarah took the photograph. It showed a group of young men in fatigues, rifles slung, their faces sunburned and weary. And there, standing in the middle, was her grandfather, strong, proud, alive. Her throat closed. She wanted to speak, but no words came. She only nodded, clutching the photograph like a lifeline. As the sun sank behind the mountains, Sarah stood with her grandfather's rifle in one hand and his memory in the other. The applause, the victory, the record, it all faded. What remained was something quieter, something stronger. She had proven herself, yes, but more importantly, she had kept a promise. She had carried forward a legacy. And as the desert wind moved softly through the pavilion, Sarah knew one truth more deeply than ever before. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. What happens when the world suddenly wants more from you than you ever asked to give? In the days following the competition, Sarah Martinez's life shifted in ways she hadn't prepared for. The whispers had grown into headlines. Local papers ran stories with titles like "The Silent Marksman," "Phoenix's Rising Star," and "Legacy of a Legend Lives On." Shooting magazines wanted interviews. National competitive teams sent her emails, invitations highlighted in bold. Firearms manufacturers reached out, offering sponsorship deals, free equipment, promises of exposure. At Morrison's gun shop, customers who once smirked or waved her off now sought her out, asking questions about ballistics, about scopes, about marksmanship. Some looked at her with awe, some with curiosity, some with envy. But for Sarah, the noise of it all felt heavier than the silence she'd carried before. One evening, a week after the competition, she sat behind the counter long after closing hours, the Winchester across her lap. Frank Morrison stood nearby, leaning against a display case. "You did it, kid," he said quietly. "I've been around shooters my whole life, and I've never seen anything like what you pulled off. You've got people talking across the state, maybe across the country soon." Sarah shook her head, running her fingers along the rifle's stock. "That's not why I did it." "I know," Frank's eyes softened. "That's what makes it real. But just because you didn't ask for the spotlight doesn't mean it isn't here now. What matters is what you do with it." She looked up at him. "What if I'm not meant for the spotlight?" Frank chuckled softly. "Spotlight doesn't ask if you're ready. It just shines. But you get to decide whether you hide from it or use it to reflect something bigger than yourself." Sarah didn't answer. Her grandfather's words echoed in her memory. "It's not about proving yourself to others. It's about honoring the tradition." The following week, she accepted an invitation to speak at a veterans shooting symposium. The organizers had reached out not because of her win, but because of her grandfather's name. When she walked into the hall, carrying the Winchester in its case, conversation stopped. Men in their 60s and 70s turned, eyes softening with recognition at the name Robert Martinez. Afterward, one veteran approached, his hair white, his back bent. "Your grandfather trained me at Bragg," he said, his voice breaking with age. "I was 19, didn't know a thing. He taught me not just how to shoot, but how to think. Saved my life more times than I can count." Sarah listened, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time, she realized her grandfather's reach extended far beyond her. His legacy wasn't just in her, it lived in dozens, maybe hundreds of soldiers who had carried his lessons into battle. That night, lying awake in her small apartment, Sarah felt the weight of it. The victory hadn't ended anything. It had begun something bigger, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. A month later, she left her job at Morrison's. Jim and Frank hugged her like family, promising the shop would always be home. But Sarah knew she couldn't stay behind the counter anymore. The world outside was calling her, louder every day. She entered more competitions, won most of them, sometimes with her grandfather's Winchester, sometimes with newer rifles companies sent her to test. But always she made it clear, the rifle was just a tool. The shooter mattered more. Reporters asked her about her secret, how she stayed so calm, how she read the wind, how she waited when others rushed. She gave the same answer every time. "My grandfather taught me that patience is stronger than pride, that every shot matters, not just the perfect ones, the missed ones too." Some understood, some didn't, but she never strayed from the truth. 6 months after Phoenix, she stood on a national stage in Nevada, facing competitors from across the country. The lights were brighter, the cameras larger, the crowd bigger. But as she lay prone at the firing line, the old lessons returned like they always did. In, out, heartbeat, pause, shot. She won again. Afterward, a sponsor presented her with a check, cameras flashing. But Sarah wasn't thinking about the money. She wasn't even thinking about the victory. She was thinking about the quiet ranch in Montana, the man who had taught her to breathe between heartbeats, the afternoons where silence meant more than applause ever could. The next day, Sarah made a decision. If the world was going to put her in the spotlight, she would bend that light back to where it belonged. She used her winnings to start the Robert Martinez Foundation, a program dedicated to teaching young marksmen not just technical skill, but discipline, patience, and respect for the weapon. She wanted to pass down what her grandfather had given her. Not trophies, not headlines, a tradition. The first class met in a dusty field outside Phoenix. 10 kids, some as young as 12, their eyes wide as Sarah laid the Winchester across a bench. She didn't start with how to hold it. She didn't start with sights or scopes. She started with silence. "You respect the rifle by respecting yourself," she told them. "It doesn't start with the trigger. It starts with your breath, your patience, your ability to wait when the world tells you to rush." Some of the kids fidgeted. Some looked confused, but Sarah didn't mind. She knew her grandfather had said the same things to her, and it had taken years for the lessons to sink in. Later, as she packed up, one girl lingered behind. She was small, maybe 13, her hands awkward on the rifle she carried. "Miss Martinez," she asked shyly, "what if I'm not good enough? Everyone else seems better than me." Sarah knelt down, her eyes level with the girl. "Do you know what my grandfather told me when I said the same thing?" The girl shook her head. "He said missing is part of learning. The bullet doesn't define you. The patience does. Can you breathe again? Can you find calm again? That's what makes you a marksman." The girl's shoulders relaxed. She smiled faintly. That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment, paperwork for the foundation spread out before her. Sponsorship contracts, schedules, invitations, all of it pressing in. But the Winchester leaned against the wall beside her desk, silent, steady. She reached for her phone, scrolling to the photo of her and her grandfather. She touched the screen gently. "I'm trying, Grandpa. I hope I'm doing it right." Outside, the city hummed, alive with noise. Inside, Sarah breathed in the silence that had always carried her. And though the world now called her champion, though headlines painted her as a prodigy, she knew one truth that cut deeper than any trophy or contract. Victory fades, fame fades, but legacy endures. And every time she lay behind the rifle, every time she found the stillness between heartbeats, Sarah Martinez carried forward not just her grandfather's name, but the moral he had lived by. Sometimes, the strongest voice is the one that never needs to shout. What happens when the silence you once loved feels buried beneath the world's noise? Months had passed since Sarah Martinez's record-breaking win, but the echoes of that final shot still rippled through her life. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. At airports, strangers asked for photos. At competitions, crowds pressed against the fences, calling her name. Companies offered her contracts she never imagined, gear endorsements, public speaking tour, even television appearances. On the surface, it looked like everything a competitor could dream of. But for Sarah, the spotlight felt like a weight pressing against her chest. She hadn't asked for this. She had wanted to honor her grandfather, not become a brand. The tension grew worse with every event. After her third national win, she found herself standing on a stage beneath blinding lights, a trophy in her hands, cameras flashing like gunfire. A reporter leaned into the microphone. "Sarah, people are calling you the future of competitive shooting. You've broken records, you've inspired a generation, you've carried your grandfather's legacy to new heights. What's next for you?" Sarah froze. Her mind flashed to Montana, to a quiet ridge where the only question had ever been whether the wind would calm long enough for the next shot. That world felt far away now, hidden beneath headlines and contracts. She forced a smile. What's next is continuing to learn and to pass on what was given to me. It was the truth, but the noise drowned out the heart of it. Later that night, in her hotel room, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed with the Winchester laid across her knees. She didn't even bother with the new rifles the sponsors had shipped her. They felt like strangers in her hands. This one still carried his fingerprints in the grain, his lessons in every scratch. She whispered into the silence, "Am I losing it, Grandpa? Am I losing you?" The following weeks blurred into travel, competitions, and interviews. She stood in studios with earpieces clipped to her shirt, answering polished questions with rehearsed answers. She smiled for photographers while holding rifles she had no bond with. She shook hands with executives who wanted her face on billboards. The noise grew louder, but inside the silence grew smaller. One evening, at a gala in Las Vegas, Sarah wore a dress instead of fatigues, heels instead of boots. She moved through a sea of polished men in tuxedos and women in gowns. Sponsors clinked glasses of champagne, laughing loudly, their words filled with profit margins and branding strategies. At her table, a sleek-haired executive leaned close, his voice smooth. "Sarah, we're talking about a national campaign. You could be the face of American marksmanship. Television ads, posters, full coverage, you'd be everywhere." Everywhere, the word lodged in her chest like a shard. Everywhere meant nowhere. Everywhere meant lost. She excused herself, slipping away to the balcony. The city sprawled below, neon lights buzzing, music echoing from the strip. But above the city, the sky stretched wide and empty, stars barely visible through the glow. Her eyes closed, she imagined Montana again, the ridge, the steel plate at 600 yards, her grandfather's voice steady, patient. "Don't chase the noise, Sarah. Let silence do the talking." Her chest ached. She whispered into the night air, "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I don't know how to hold on to it anymore." Behind her, footsteps approached. It was Harrison. The colonel had been watching her quietly over the past months, never intruding but always present at major events. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said gently. Sarah didn't turn. "I don't belong here." Harrison stepped beside her, looking out at the city lights. Maybe not, but you belong somewhere, and it's up to you to choose where." She swallowed hard. "I just wanted to honor him, but now it feels like I'm betraying him, selling him." Harrison's voice softened. "Do you think he would have wanted you to hide forever? He taught you so you could carry it forward, not bury it." Sarah looked at him, tears burning her eyes. "But how do I carry it forward without losing myself?" Harrison met her gaze, calm and steady. "By remembering that legacy isn't about applause, it's about choices. Every time you pick up that rifle, every time you teach someone patience instead of pride, you're carrying him. The rest, it's just noise. Ignore it." His words struck deep. The next morning, Sarah turned down the executive's offer. She canceled 3 interviews. She returned a brand new rifle still in its box, and she drove out of Las Vegas in silence, the Winchester in its case beside her. 2 days later, she stood again in the dusty field outside Phoenix, the Robert Martinez Foundation banner flapping in the desert wind. 10 students waited with rifles on benches, their eyes curious and eager. Sarah smiled faintly. "We're not here to shoot fast. We're not here to impress anyone. We're here to breathe, to wait, to find patience when the world tells you to rush." She moved among them, adjusting elbows, guiding fingers, reminding them to wait for calm. And as she watched the first target fall, struck clean by a nervous teenager who had steadied just long enough, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. That night, alone in her apartment, she sat again with the Winchester. She touched its stock, closed her eyes, and breathed deep. The silence returned, slow and steady, like an old friend coming home. And she realized something simple. She had feared losing her grandfather's legacy in the noise of the world. But legacy wasn't something fame could steal. It wasn't something contracts could twist. Legacy lived in the way she carried herself, in the way she taught others, in the patience she chose over and over, even when the world demanded noise. The silence wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for her to choose it again. And as Sarah leaned back, whispering a soft prayer of thanks into the quiet room, she knew that the lesson she would pass down to every student, every competitor, every person who asked for her secret would be the same one her grandfather had given her. Sometimes strength isn't in being heard, it's in knowing when to be silent. What does it mean to finish a story that never really ends? Months had turned into a year since Sarah Martinez's first victory in Phoenix. In that time, she had stood on podiums, turned down contracts, taught children, and shouldered the weight of a name that still echoed in hushed tones among soldiers and shooters alike. But the truest moments weren't the ones captured by cameras. They were the quiet mornings in the desert, her foundation students sprawled on mats, learning to breathe between heartbeats. They were the nights when she sat with the Winchester in her lap, her grandfather's lessons wrapped around her like an old, familiar coat. It was in those moments Sarah felt closest to him. The anniversary of his passing approached, and with it, a heaviness she couldn't shake. She took a week off from the competitions and the classes, packed the Winchester carefully, and drove north toward Montana. The farther she got from the city, the quieter the world became. The desert gave way to plains, the plains to rolling hills, the hills to the dark pines of the mountain country. And finally, she turned down the gravel road that led to the ranch. The house still stood, weathered and creaking, though the paint had long since faded. The barn leaned a little more than it used to. The field stretched wide and golden, the grass rippling in the wind. She parked the truck and stepped out, the silence wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. The air smelled of earth and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. Inside the house, dust lay thick on the furniture, the photographs still hanging crooked on the walls. She found the one she remembered best, her grandfather, 20 years younger, holding the Winchester, his arm draped around her as a child. She traced the frame with trembling fingers. That evening she carried the rifle out to the ridge behind the ranch, the ridge where he had taught her patience, where the steel plate still hung, rusted but standing. She laid out her mat, settled prone, and stared through the scope at the target 600 yards away. The wind whispered through the grass. The mirage shimmered faintly above the field. She breathed in, out, felt the rhythm of her heart. The years between now and then fell away. She was 16 again, frustrated, near tears, and his voice was right beside her. "Don't fight it, Sarah. Don't curse the wind. Listen, respect it. It will carry you." Her finger rested on the trigger. She waited. The pause came. She fired. The shot rang across the valley, echoing off the trees. The plate shuddered, a clean strike dead center. Sarah lowered the rifle, tears streaming freely now. She sat up, the grass brushing against her arms, and whispered into the wind, "I did it, Grandpa. I carried it. I carried you." The silence answered as it always did, not with words but with presence. The following morning, she walked the fields, remembering summers spent chasing grasshoppers, evenings spent cleaning rifles on the porch, nights spent listening to stories of Vietnam she hadn't fully understood until now. She knelt in the tall grass and pressed her hand against the earth. "This is where it began," she murmured, "and it's where it will always live." When she returned to Phoenix, she carried something different in her. Not the weight of expectation, not the noise of applause, but peace. The foundation grew, dozens of kids, then hundreds. Some of them would go on to join the military, some would stay in civilian life, but all of them would leave with lessons bigger than shooting: patience, discipline, respect. And every time Sarah stood before them, she reminded them, the bullet doesn't define you, the patience does. Legacy isn't what you win, it's what you pass down. Years passed, competitions came and went, records rose and fell, fame flickered as it always does, but Sarah's work endured. She became known not just as a shooter, but as a teacher, a mentor, a keeper of something quieter and stronger than trophies. One day, long after the headlines had faded, a young woman from her foundation stood on a national stage, rifle steady, patience in her breath. She made her shot, and when asked who had taught her, she said, "Sarah Martinez. She told me silence is stronger than noise." Sarah watched from the sidelines, a faint smile touching her lips. The torch had been passed again. That evening, sitting alone with the Winchester beside her, Sarah thought of her grandfather, thought of the promise she had carried, thought of the silence that had spoken louder than applause ever could. And she understood, finally, the moral of it all. Legacy is not a shadow to live under. It is a light to carry forward. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.